My son left me a voicemail. 3 words that changed everything. Pack your things. His wife was done with me living under her roof, he said. Their roof. My house. I listened to that message twice. Then I smiled, deleted it, and started making calls. By the time he woke up the next morning, I had already begun the process of taking back everything I had ever given him. He just didn't know it yet. Before I go any further, subscribe to the channel and drop a comment telling me what time it is wherever you're watching from. I love knowing who's out there. My name is Harold Mercer. Most people call me Hank. I'm 63 years old, and I spent 31 years building a construction business from nothing. Started with a used pickup truck, a set of tools I bought secondhand from a retiring carpenter, and a reputation I protected like it was currency, because it was. By the time I sold the company, I had 42 employees, contracts across Central Texas, and enough money set aside that I could retire comfortably without touching my rental income. I'm not telling you this to brag. I'm telling you so you understand what kind of man my son thought he was dealing with when he decided I was disposable. The house on Ridgemont Court in Cedar Park isn't anything flashy. 4 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, half an acre of land with a workshop out back where I spend most of my time. I bought it in 2004 for $310,000. The Austin market being what it is, it appraised at $940,000 last spring. I know that number by heart because my son brought it up at dinner 4 months before he left me that voicemail. Said it with a kind of hunger in his eyes I recognized from the job site. The look a man gets when he sees something he wants but knows he can't afford. My son wasn't always like this. I raised him alone after his mother passed from cancer when he was 15. He was the kind of kid who stayed up with me when I had early bids to review, who learned how to read a blueprint before he could legally drive. We weren't just father and son. We were a team. Something shifted when he turned 32 and married my daughter-in-law. I don't say that to blame her entirely, because that would be too easy. But the man I watched walk down that aisle looked like my son. The man who left me that voicemail was a stranger wearing his face. She came into our lives at a cookout at my neighbor's place. She was sharp and put together, the kind of woman who enters a room already knowing where every eye is going. She worked in marketing for a tech company. Talked fast, thought faster. In those first months, I liked her. She seemed ambitious in a productive way. She seemed to genuinely care about my son. I was wrong on the second point, but it took me 4 years to understand that. They married in a destination wedding in Scottsdale that I paid a significant portion of. Not because I was asked in a way that felt like asking. It was presented to me as the obvious thing a father would do, and I did it because I was still operating under the assumption that my son and I had the kind of relationship where such generosity would be remembered with gratitude. I made a lot of assumptions in those years. Assumptions are expensive. They moved into my house 14 months after the wedding. My daughter-in-law's lease ended, and their apartment search kept running into what she called unreasonable landlords. The plan, as it was described to me over dinner one Sunday, was 6 months at most. Just long enough for them to find something that fit their needs in a market that had gone, in her words, absolutely insane. I told them they were welcome. I meant it. That was 3 years and 4 months ago. The first year was manageable. They paid for their own groceries, mostly. They kept common areas reasonably clean. My daughter-in-law worked from home and had claimed the dining room table as her workspace, which I found mildly irritating but said nothing about because I had a workshop and didn't need the dining room table for anything other than meals that she had quietly stopped joining. She ate at her desk while she worked, or said she worked. Her job title changed 3 times in 18 months, until one day there was no job title at all, and she was pivoting, her word, to building a personal brand around interior design and lifestyle content. The fact that she was building this brand from a house she didn't own, featuring furniture and a kitchen I had paid for, was not something she appeared to find ironic. By the second year, I had become invisible in my own home, in the specific way that only family can make you invisible. Not hostile exactly, not at first, just unnecessary. My presence in the kitchen when they were cooking was an inconvenience. My television preferences were a source of quiet sighs. When I mentioned I was planning to repaint the front porch railing, my daughter-in-law spent 20 minutes explaining why she had a vision for the exterior that we should probably discuss first. The porch I had built with my own hands in 2009. My son said nothing. That was the part that I kept trying to rationalize, kept finding new explanations for. He was conflict-averse. She was strong-willed. He was tired from work. He needed to keep the peace. I cycled through these explanations because the alternative explanation was one I wasn't ready to accept. The comments were gradual, then they weren't. She started making observations about my woodworking that she framed as concern. All those sawdust particles can't be good for your lungs at your age. Said it at breakfast like she was telling me the weather. I was in the kitchen eating toast she had not offered to make. My workshop, for the record, has a dust collection system I installed myself. I know how to protect my lungs. I have been working with wood longer than she has been alive. There were observations about my driving, about the way I organized the refrigerator, about a lamp in the living room she wanted to replace because it didn't fit the aesthetic, her word again, she was going for in the space. My space. I said nothing. I told myself I was being the bigger person. What I was actually being was a doormat, but I had not yet found the language for that. The comment I remember most came on a Tuesday evening in February. I had just come in from the workshop and I was washing my hands at the kitchen sink. She was on the phone with someone, her back to me, and she said, and I will never forget this, I cannot have people walking through here tracking sawdust all over my floors. Like I was a boarder she had not approved. Like those floors were not ones I had refinished myself in the summer of 2017. I stood there at the sink until she finished her call. She turned around, saw me, didn't flinch, and asked if I wanted her to add anything to the grocery order. I said no thank you. I dried my hands and went back to my workshop and sat down in the chair I keep by the window and thought for a long time about what I was doing. That was when I started paying attention to the numbers. Their income, as best I could calculate from what my son occasionally mentioned and what his wife's online presence suggested, was somewhere around $68,000 combined in a good year. My son managed a flooring supply warehouse. Steady work, decent money, not enough for the life they were living. The truck my daughter-in-law drove was leased at $612 a month. The closet she had expanded into half of the guest room was filled with things whose tags I sometimes saw still attached. She took solo trips to visit friends in Nashville and Denver that she documented on her social media in a way that always seemed to suggest a life of curated abundance. I was subsidizing that abundance without a single conversation about it. I didn't do anything with that information right away. I kept it. I watched. I waited. Not because I was plotting. Not then. I was still hoping my son would become the man I had raised and have a conversation with me like an adult. The thing that changed everything was not actually the voicemail. The voicemail was the last thing. The thing that changed everything was a Saturday afternoon in early September when a woman named Diane moved into the house 2 streets over. I met Diane at a neighborhood association meeting I had been going to for 11 years. She was new to the area, 61 years old, recently retired from a career in landscape architecture, and she had just finished restoring a 1940s bungalow she had bought in rough shape for what she called a project. She sat next to me at the meeting because the other seats were taken. We talked about her renovation for most of the 2 hours. She knew what a finger joint was. She knew the difference between Douglas fir and southern yellow pine. I cannot explain how much that meant to me after years of conversations in my own home that treated my expertise like a quirky old man hobby. We started having coffee. She had opinions about everything and was never unpleasant about having them. She laughed easily. She had a daughter in Seattle who called every Sunday and actually wanted to know how her mother was doing. Being around Diane reminded me what normal felt like, what being seen felt like, what it felt like to walk into a room and have someone actually glad you were there. I mentioned her to my son casually one evening. Said I had made a new friend in the neighborhood, someone who appreciated woodworking. His wife looked up from her laptop. She asked questions that were not really questions. How old is she? Does she own her home or rent? Has she been married before? The kind of questions you ask when you are trying to establish whether something is a threat. My son said nothing. He looked at the table. I let it go. I should not have. 3 weeks later, I told them I would like to have Diane over for dinner. Nothing formal, just the 4 of us, a home-cooked meal, a chance to introduce her properly. My daughter-in-law put down her phone slowly, which I had learned was not a good sign. She said she wasn't sure she was comfortable with that. I asked her what she meant. She said bringing a stranger into the house without more notice wasn't something she could just agree to. I reminded her, as calmly as I could, that it was my house. She looked at me for a moment, and then said, in a tone that was almost kind, which made it worse, "We think of this as our home, and our comfort matters too." My son said nothing. I said goodnight, and went to my workshop and sat in the dark for 45 minutes. That was on a Wednesday. The voicemail came the following Sunday. I had been out for a walk. When I came back, there was a message from my son's number, but it wasn't quite his voice. Or rather, it was his voice saying words I had never heard him say before, words that sounded assembled from somewhere else. He said things were not working out with the living arrangement. He said his wife was under a lot of stress. He said it would probably be best if I started thinking about other options, maybe something smaller, somewhere designed for someone at my stage of life. He used the phrase "our home" twice. He said he hoped I would understand. I listened to it standing on my own porch. Then I sat down in the chair I keep by the front door, and I looked out at the yard I had planted, the oak tree I had watered through 2 droughts, the driveway I had poured myself 20 years ago. I sat there for a while. Then I went inside, made a cup of coffee, and texted my attorney. His name is Frank Gallagher. I have known him for 22 years. He handled the sale of my construction business and has managed my estate documents since before my son graduated high school. When I texted him that Sunday evening, he responded within 10 minutes. We met the next morning. I laid out everything in Frank's office. The timeline, the free housing, the comments, the voicemail, all of it. He listened the way good attorneys listen, which is quietly and without expression. When I finished, he opened a drawer and pulled out a folder I recognized from our last meeting, which had been 3 years prior when I had quietly updated my living trust and property documents. Frank had noted at the time that I was being unusually thorough. I had told him I believed in being prepared. He had not asked for more explanation. He looked up from the folder. You started getting ready for this before you knew it would happen. I told him I had been in construction long enough to know when a structure was going to fail. The only question was whether you noticed the signs in time to protect yourself or not. We spent 2.5 hours going over everything. The property deed, which named me as sole owner with absolute clarity. The utility accounts, everyone in my name for the past 19 years. The tax records, the insurance. Not a single document bore my son's name in any capacity that suggested ownership or legal claim. When we finished, Frank leaned back and said there was nothing legally complicated about this situation. I owned the property. They were occupants without a formal lease. I had the right to ask them to leave with proper notice. I told him I wanted a formal 60-day notice delivered by certified mail and courier simultaneously. I wanted no room for any claim of ambiguity. Frank nodded and said he would have it drafted by Thursday. I told him to make it 30 days. He looked at me for a moment, then wrote something down. 30 days, he said. Understood. I drove home that afternoon by a different route, past a storage facility on Highway 183. I noted the rates on the sign. I was already mentally cataloging what I would move first. The notice arrived on a Thursday, exactly as Frank had said. I was not home when it was delivered. I was at Diane's house, helping her re-glue a set of loose chair spindles from a dining set she had found at an estate sale in Round Rock. My phone began going off at 11:47 in the morning. My son called 4 times in 8 minutes. My daughter-in-law called twice. I let them go to voicemail and kept working on the chairs. Diane asked if I needed to deal with that. I told her the chairs were more important. She laughed. I have thought about that laugh many times since. I answered on the 9th call. My son's voice was tight in the way I recognized from when he was a teenager and had done something he couldn't talk his way out of. He asked if I had actually sent this. I told him yes. He said he didn't understand. I told him the document was written in plain English, and I trusted he could read it. He said this was insane. I asked him which part he found unclear. He said he didn't have anywhere to go. I said that was something he had had 3 years and 4 months to work out and had chosen not to. My daughter-in-law got on the phone then. She was using a voice I had not heard from her before, lower and more measured, the one she used when she was managing a situation. She said she understood I was upset. She said she thought we could find a way to make this work for everyone. I asked her to tell me the last time she had considered what would work for me. Silence. I told her the 30-day clock started the day the notice was delivered and suggested she use the time productively. I ended the call. That evening, I drove to a storage facility and reserved the largest unit they had. The following weekend, I began quietly moving things I cared about. Tools, lumber stock, my collection of antique hand planes I had been accumulating for 15 years, the boxes of photographs from my son's childhood that I was not willing to leave in a house that would belong to someone else. I worked methodically, and without drama, and my son and his wife watched me from the window of the guest room they had been occupying for 3 years and 4 months, and said nothing. What I did not tell them was that 2 weeks before the notice was delivered, I had quietly approached a property management company about listing the house as a long-term rental. The monthly income at market rate would be $4,200. I had also spoken to Frank about selling outright if the right offer came through quickly. Cedar Park had become one of the hotter submarkets in the Austin metro, and Frank knew buyers who moved fast. What I also did not tell them was that 3 years prior, when my son had asked me to co-sign a personal loan for what he described as an investment in a food truck business that never materialized, I had structured my involvement through a separate financial agreement that allowed me to withdraw my guarantee under specific conditions. Estrangement qualified. Frank had advised me of that when we set it up. I had filed the paperwork to begin that process the morning after my attorney meeting. The thing about people who take advantage of generosity is that they assume the generous party has no strategy. They see patience and read weakness. They see accommodation and read obligation. My son and his wife had spent 3 years reading me wrong. They were about to receive a corrected edition. The calls continued for the first week. My son left messages that moved through the emotional stages in fairly predictable sequence. Anger, negotiation, appeals to family, and then finally a version of contrition that felt rehearsed. My daughter-in-law posted on her social media about toxic family dynamics and the courage it took to prioritize your mental health. She did not name me directly. She didn't have to. I saw it because Diane showed me, and I read it once and handed the phone back and told Diane what I thought about it, which was that a person who had lived rent-free in another person's home for over 3 years was perhaps not the strongest candidate to lecture the internet about parasitic relationships. Diane laughed again. I was starting to collect those laughs like the hand planes in my workshop, each one a small, real thing worth having. On the 22nd day, my son came to me in the workshop. I knew he would eventually. I had left the door unlocked. He stood in the doorway the way he used to when he was 9 years old, and had broken something he was afraid to tell me about. He looked genuinely terrible. He had lost weight, and his eyes had the hollowed-out quality of someone who had not been sleeping. He sat down on the stool near my workbench without being invited, which told me he was not entirely gone, that somewhere inside this version of him was still the kid who had always felt comfortable in this room. I kept working on the piece in front of me, a mid-century dresser with seized drawer slides that I had been rehabilitating for 2 weeks. I waited. He said he knew he had messed up. He said the voicemail was a mistake. He said his wife had been going through something and he had been trying to keep everyone happy and had handled everything badly. He was using all the right words in the wrong order, and I could hear in the arrangement of them that someone had helped him prepare. I asked him what he thought I had done wrong. He looked at me. I asked again. I said I wanted him to tell me one specific thing I had done incorrectly in 3.5 years. He couldn't. I watched him search for something and come up empty, and I felt something that was not quite sadness and not quite anger, more like the feeling you get when a diagnosis confirms something you already knew. I told him the notice stood. I told him I had started the process to withdraw my co-signature on his loan and that he should expect a letter from the bank within the next 10 days. I watched his face change. He said I couldn't do that. I said I already had. He said that would destroy his credit. I told him a lot of things destroyed credit and that accountability was the one his choices had earned. He said the word we had both been avoiding. He said I was punishing him. I set down the piece I was working on and I looked at my son directly, the way I had looked at him when he was 17 and had lied to me about where he had been. The look that told him I already knew everything and was waiting to see if he would tell the truth. I told him I was not punishing him. I told him punishment was something you did to change behavior. What I was doing was removing myself from an arrangement that had cost me 4 years of dignity and allowing the natural results of his choices to occur without my interference. I told him there was a difference between the two and that he should think about it. He left without another word. Through the workshop window, I watched him cross the yard and go back inside, and I went back to the dresser. On the 29th day, they were gone. I came home from Diane's and the house was empty. They had taken everything they had brought in and left the rooms in a state that told me the leaving had been done in haste and frustration. There were marks on walls where furniture had been dragged without care. A broken towel rod in the guest bath that had been broken for who knows how long and never mentioned. The guest bedroom carpet had a stain that had not been there before they arrived. None of it surprised me. I documented everything carefully, photographed every room, filed an insurance claim for the damage, and spent a quiet Saturday cleaning. That night I sat on the porch for the first time in years without listening for footsteps behind me, without calculating whose mood I was about to navigate. The air tasted different. I know how that sounds, but I don't know another way to say it. The quiet was different. Frank called the following Monday to confirm the bank had completed its review of the co-signed loan. My son's debt-to-income ratio without my backing failed the bank's threshold. He would need to either find a replacement co-signer, pay the balance in full, or negotiate terms directly. Given his current financial situation, none of those options was clean. That was not something I had engineered for cruelty. It was the natural result of a financial structure I had put in place with appropriate safeguards after years of watching money disappear without acknowledgement. The offer on the house came through a real estate connection of Frank's 2 weeks after my son and daughter-in-law vacated. A couple relocating from California, both engineers, pre-approved for cash, closing timeline flexible. They offered $915,000. I countered at $930. They accepted within the hour. We closed 6 weeks later. Standing in Frank's office, signing the final documents, I thought about the number of times I had walked that property line. About the morning I poured the workshop foundation myself because I wanted to know it was right. About the oak tree and the 2 droughts. I thought about all of it, and then I signed my name in the places Frank indicated, and I let it go. The proceeds, after the remaining mortgage balance and closing costs, came to $811,000. I put $600 into a diversified portfolio and used the remainder as down payment on a smaller place in Georgetown, about 30 minutes north. 2 bedrooms, a detached workshop bigger than the one I'd had, a good-sized lot with mature trees, and nobody in it who did not want to be there. I paid cash. It was mine in a way the Ridgemont house had stopped being. Diane helped me move in on a Saturday. She brought sandwiches and strong opinions about furniture placement and a speaker that played music I had not heard in years. We spent the afternoon arranging things and arguing pleasantly about the placement of my workbench and whether a certain lamp belonged in the living room or the bedroom. I told her it belonged wherever she thought it looked best. She looked at me for a moment like I had said something surprising. Then she smiled and put the lamp in the living room. 6 weeks after I moved in, my son called from a number I didn't recognize. He was renting a room from a former coworker while my daughter-in-law, apparently, had relocated to Houston for a new position that had materialized with unusual speed. I did not ask questions about the timeline of that departure. My son told me he had started seeing a counselor. He told me he had been doing a lot of thinking. He said he knew sorry was not enough, but that he was saying it anyway because it was true. I listened to all of it. I told him I heard him. I told him I was glad he was getting some support. I told him that rebuilding trust was a long project, and that he should not expect it to move on any timeline other than the one it actually required. He said he understood. He said he wasn't calling to ask for anything. I told him I believed him. We talked for 11 minutes, and then said goodnight. I sat in my new workshop after that call and worked for a while on the project I had been starting and stopping for a month. A rocking chair I was building from scratch. White oak, traditional joinery, no nails, no staples, no shortcuts. The kind of piece that takes 6 months if you do it right and lasts 100 years. I had been wanting to build one for years and had never found the time or the stillness for it. I had both now. Diane came by the following evening and asked how the call had gone. I told her it had gone as well as it could have. She asked if I thought things would eventually be different with my son. I told her I thought things were already different. Whether they became something good depended on choices he had not yet made, and I had learned not to preemptively account for other people's choices in my own calculations. She thought about that for a moment, and then she said it sounded lonely, not saying that bitterly, just honestly the way she said things. I told her it had been lonelier, being surrounded by people who treated my presence as a problem to manage. She nodded slowly. Fair point, she said. We had dinner that night on the back porch of my new house, with the sound of the trees moving in the wind and the smell of wood smoke from a neighbor's fire pit, and no weight in the air, no navigation required. Just 2 people eating and talking and being honest with each other without it costing either of us anything. I have spent a lot of time over these past months thinking about what I would have done differently, not in the last year, but in the years before it. The honest answer is that I would have drawn lines sooner. Not cruelly, not dramatically, but earlier. I would have had the direct conversation with my son in year 1 that I avoided because I kept hoping it would not be necessary. I would have treated accommodation as a gift rather than a default, would have named it as such, would have attached conditions in writing. I know how to write contracts. I have signed thousands of them. The one I failed to write was the one that mattered most. My son texts occasionally now. Short messages, updates, nothing that asks for anything. Last month he told me he had gotten a promotion. I told him that was good to hear and meant it. We are not close. I do not know if we will become close again. I have stopped trying to project the answer to that question and started simply responding to the evidence as it presents itself, the same way I assess a piece of wood before I begin working it. No assumptions about what it should be, just attention to what it actually is. The rocking chair is nearly finished. Another few weeks of work and then several coats of finish and a long cure. I have already decided where it will sit. On the porch of this house that belongs entirely to me, facing the trees. In the morning, when the light comes in sideways and the air is still cool, and there is nowhere I am required to be, and no one I am required to perform contentment for. I chose myself. After 63 years of taking care of other things, other people, other obligations, I finally chose myself. And the strangest part is that it did not feel selfish. It felt like something I had been owed for a long time and had simply forgotten to collect. If this story spoke to something you recognize, hit the like button and subscribe. Leave a comment below. I read every one. And if you want to hear another story, the next one is right on your screen. Thank you for being here.